Welcome to everybody. We're just waiting for everyone to go ahead and join with us today. This is the Youth Power 2 Learning and Evaluation, Integrating Mental Health and Psychosocial Support Toolkit launch. My name is Cole Simcoe. I am the events manager supporting YP2LE. So we can go ahead and get started. I will go ahead and hand things off to Danya. Danya, welcome.
Thanks, Cole. Welcome everyone to the webinar introducing the new toolkit, integrating mental health and psychosocial support into youth programming. And thank you all for joining us and for making the time to be here. My name is Danya Fawaz, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I am the Youth Development Specialist for Youth Power 2 Learning and Evaluation, and I served in a technical support role in the development of this toolkit. Next slide. So in this webinar, we will start off by exploring what the purpose is and why this toolkit is needed. Then we'll define youth mental health and psychosocial support, which we'll also refer to as MHPSS. And this will serve as a basis to explore the toolkit structure and resources. And finally, we'll be hearing from a partner organization, Waves for Change, on the potential uses of the toolkit. We hope that by the end of the hour with us today, you're familiar with the toolkit and have some ideas on how to start using this resource. Next slide, please. So to give you some background on this activity, the USAID funded Youth Power 2 Learning and Evaluation activity, or YP2LE, deepens the integration of positive youth development evidence and best practices into youth programming to ensure more sustainable change. YP2LE activities are designed to examine the impact of cross-sectoral youth programming and to give practitioners the information, tools, and resources that they need to develop high-quality, impactful, and sustainable youth programs, allowing empowered youth to work alongside supportive adults to create the kind of sustainable change in individuals and systems that leads to self-reliance. And so we achieve this through a four-pronged approach that includes research on PYD, or positive youth development, a learning network, 2 digital platforms, youthpower.org and youthlead.org, and a rapid response technical support to USAID missions. And you can always find out more by visiting youthpower.org. Next slide, please. I would now like to introduce our speakers, starting with the team who worked on this toolkit. We have Paul Bolton, who is the Mental Health and Psychosocial Support Coordinator for USAID. He has extensive field experience in MHPSS programming and research in Sub-Saharan Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. Paul served as a technical advisor in the development of the toolkit. I would also like to introduce Abir Al-Dhalimi. She is the Senior Mental Health Advisor at USAID and served as the Activity Manager for the toolkit. She has earned her doctorate in clinical psychology with extensive research and clinical experience in global mental health. And next we have the lead writer for the toolkit, Jennifer Groves. Jennifer has a master's in social work and has worked in international assistance for over 18 years with a focus on child protection and MHPSS in emergencies. She has worked for small and large NGOs, donors, and UN agencies supporting programs around the globe, including Latin America, Africa, Europe, South Asia, and the Middle East. And we're also joined by Tim Coneybear, the founder and director of Waves for Change, for a partner commentary on toolkit application. And lastly, we'll be hearing from Hannah Bristol, the Associate Director in the White House Office of Public Engagement. Hannah serves as the liaison to young people and the LGBTQ+ community and is an advocate for mental health awareness. And as we begin today, we would like to share a special message from her.
The pandemic of the past 2 years has exacerbated a parallel crisis that has been building for the past decades, both nationally and globally. The crisis of mental health and its impact on young people in particular has reached alarming levels, where now it is the leading cause of disability and the fourth leading cause of death for young people globally. Mental health is critical to achieving development objectives and resolving humanitarian crises. It is not only a vital aspect of one's own health and well-being, but also to positive engagement with family and community. For example, youth with poor mental health may find it difficult to take full advantage of available resources, including educational and training opportunities, to help them realize their full potential. In all sectors, including education, global health, agriculture, economic development, and democracy and governance, to name a few, programming that ignores the mental health needs of participants will be less effective. Adolescence and youth is a challenging time of life. The brain is flexible and changing. It's open to develop new capacities, but also open to mental health problems that can persist for the remainder of one's life. For this reason, half of all mental conditions begin by age 14. This makes adolescent and youth years a critical time in which to intervene, to help put youth on a path to lifelong mental and physical health, and as engaged members of their families and societies. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to partnering with communities, health systems, and young leaders who have often been first to destigmatize discussion of these issues to improve our investments in effective solutions. As the youth liaison in the White House Office of Public Engagement, I'm so pleased to support the launch of this mental health and psychosocial support toolkit. It is the first resource of its kind by USAID to support mental health services for youth, and I know it will advance the US government's global contributions to building resilient and healthy youth, families, and communities.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the launch of USAID's Youth MHPSS Toolkit. I'm Paul Bolton. I'm the USAID Mental Health and Psychosocial Support Coordinator. I was one of the technical advisors on the toolkit. It was developed in response to requests from mission staff and implementing partners for tools and guidance to implement youth mental health programming. In particular, staff asked how to integrate mental health into their other youth programs to meet the large mental health needs that they have observed. As a result, this toolkit is designed to provide the resources that programs need to design and implement to monitor and evaluate mental health programs. This first USAID MHPSS Toolkit is appropriately focused on youth as being the stage in life where mental health issues have the largest and the most frequent impact. We are excited to make this resource available to all our USAID colleagues and partners, and we look forward to hearing from you as you review and use it. I now hand over to Jennifer Groves, who will lead us through a review of the toolkit contents. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. As Paul mentioned, I'm going to be providing an overview of the toolkit components. Next slide, please. So the toolkit is intended to provide strategies and tools for designing, implementing, and evaluating mental health and psychosocial support programs and activities for youth in low and middle income countries and in conflict affected areas. It's a resource for standalone programming for mental health and psychosocial support and for integrating MHPSS interventions into youth programs. The toolkit includes guidance based on good practice from MHPSS with recommendations for adapting the program designs to community needs in the local context. The toolkit comes in two formats. So the first one is an online toolkit, which you'll see on the screen. The second is an accompanying PDF version. These two formats of the toolkit work kind of hand in hand together, where the online version provides a brief high-level overview of the information. It's a really useful quick reference to the toolkit if you want to find information really quickly. The online version is going to be a really helpful and useful tool for that. The PDF version is linked throughout the online version. So if you are reading something and you want to have more information or go a little bit deeper on that particular topic, the PDF version of the toolkit is going to provide more details on that content. So they do link There are links throughout the online version that will take you directly to specific sections of the PDF toolkit. The toolkit is also not designed to be read from front to back, but it's designed to be a resource. So you would reference specific sections of the tool based upon what you're looking for. We're going to go over those components in just a minute, so you'll have a better idea as to what information is housed in what section of the toolkit. It's also a compilation of different resources. So throughout the toolkit, we produce or we provide recommendations on different tools that are out there and readily available for MHPSS programming, whether that be assessment or design, resources that you can use in your implementation of the programs, and then a section that addresses meal. Next slide, please. The toolkit can be used. We've identified 4 kind of main ways in which the toolkit can be used. There are lots of other ways that you'll probably find use for it as well in your programming. But the ones that we wanted to cover here is that first, it can be used to increase your understanding of MHPSS programming. It will help hold partners and donors accountable to the same standards of programming. So you're using the same terminology, the same reference points when developing programs for MHPSS. That it also will help guide and inform the design and implementation and evaluation of MHPSS programming. And then it points towards key resources. Next slide, please. The toolkit is broken into 4 sections. So in the PDF version, these sections are spelled out as the terminology, definitions, and contextualization. Then we have section 2, which is the evidence for youth programming. Section 3, which looks at frameworks that support MHPSS programming, and section 4, which follows the USAID program cycle. Section 4 on the online version is broken out into assessment, design, implementation, and meal tabs. We also have 3 annexes. Those look at a compendium of definitions that we found throughout the research and the development of the toolkit. We have illustrative interventions, and then a table for measurement indicators. And lastly, the toolkit includes sector-specific pullouts, and these sector-specific pullouts provide examples of programs or case examples that we looked at in the development of the toolkit, and provides a little bit more of an in-depth discussion on a particular sector and some examples of programs that use MHPSS programming within their sector or their program. Next slide, please. Section 1 provides an introduction to MHPSS terminology, the definitions, and contextualization. In the toolkit, we kept the definitions that we focused on to a handful that we felt were essential for the use of the toolkit. So we provide a definition for youth, trauma, caregiver, dimensions of well-being, positive youth development, and then mental health interventions and psychosocial interventions. For mental health interventions, toolkit defines that as interventions that address mental conditions through personalized care delivered to individuals or small groups with similar conditions. These include psychotherapy, psychoeducation to clients and their families, and pharmacology. Psychosocial interventions are those that focus on addressing stress through changes in their environment to make it less stressful, which can include, the individual's physical environment and their social environment. It also is broadly applicable information and skills that can be easily disseminated to large groups. Information that is generally relevant to populations that are under duress. We also have the compendium of definitions as an annex, which I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. Section 2 of the toolkit looks at the evidence for youth-focused mental health and psychosocial support. What works for positive results for mental health and psychosocial support? How does MHPSS programming result in positive results for youth. And so we have some examples of what that looks like on the diagram. You know, it includes positive parenting techniques that are used more frequently, strengthening the social connections between youth and their families, their communities, their teachers, future thinking. So having hopes and dreams for your future, feeling safe and secure, either in home or within your community, having that safe space, improving school performance, and then reducing violent behavior at home and in the community, as well as reducing violent and harsh parenting techniques. The toolkit, the evidence section also looks at interventions and the evidence base for those interventions, and then provides a brief discussion over some of the gaps in programming and evidence, something that we can all work on looking at within our programs, and how do we address those and contribute to the evidence base. This includes suicide prevention and response, replicating studies, the system strengthening. So how do we strengthen systems for the delivery of mental health and psychosocial support, and then disability and inclusion within these programs. Next slide, please. Section 3 of the toolkit looks at 3 frameworks that support MHPSS programming. The first one is USAID's Positive Youth Development Framework, which I will discuss a little bit more in just a minute. The other 2, we have the Social Ecological Model, and then we have the Interagency Standing Committee's IASC Intervention Pyramid, which we'll also look at later in the presentation. But for the Positive Youth Development Framework, you know, applying the PYD lens to mental health and psychosocial support involves looking at the 4 domains to identify the core elements that contribute to positive well-being. So I had mentioned when we looked at the definition slide that one of the definitions was dimensions of well-being. And in the toolkit, we define those as, there's 3 dimensions. One is positive individual well-being. The other is interpersonal well-being. And we have then skills and knowledge. So these link into the positive youth development domains in the following way. So individual well-being includes positive thoughts and emotions, such as hopefulness, self-esteem, and self-confidence, and relates to youth agency in the PYD framework. Agency includes positive identity, you know, the beliefs and values that you hold about yourself and your future, and self-efficacy, or the belief in your ability to do things well. The interpersonal well-being gets at the nurturing relationships and a sense of belonging, self-esteem, and self-confidence. It's that combination of youth assets and contribution within the PYD framework. Assets include having the interpersonal skills, such as your communication skills and your social skills, recognizing your emotions, your ability to identify feelings, and your emotional reactions to situations, and then your self-control, or your ability to manage and regulate your behavior, and how you do that, you know, within the relationships that you have as well. Contribution also includes the engagement activities and that sense of meaning. Skills and knowledge, that looks at the need to make positive decisions, the ability to effectively respond to life changes. So you have the skills to cope effectively when things change. You know how to express yourself. The skills and knowledge relate most directly to the enabling environment within PYD, which includes your positive emotional attachments, how you're bonding with others, your belonging and membership, a sense of care, support, and your sense of safety. While investments across the PYD domains still contribute to an improved sense of well-being, some youth will need additional support. MHPSS interventions complement and build on programming that applies a PYD framework by 1, strengthening elements that build positive well-being, 2, making sure programs can refer youth for additional services when necessary, and 3, ensuring access to mental health services for youth who need more focused support that extends beyond PSS. Next slide, please. The toolkit, as I mentioned earlier, follows the USAID program cycle. We have, first you start out with your assessment. Once you've collected the information about the needs for mental health, the psychosocial support needs within the community amongst the youth, then you would move on to designing your programs and your interventions. Then we have some guidance and tips on once you start actually implementing your program design, and then how you would go about monitoring, evaluating, and adapting and learning from the program that you are implementing. So next slide, please. So the first step in the process is your assessment, or what some like to refer to as an MHPSS situational analysis. Once you understand the MHPS needs and the existing capabilities, then you're gonna use that information to design the program. The toolkit includes some key tools around cultural adaptation and validating instruments, so some guidance and recommendations on how to think about that from an MHPSS perspective. We talk about workforce and assessment. How do you assess the workforce? And who are the current service providers? What kinds of mental health or psychosocial support services are already available in the community? What are you able to refer to, which gets to the mapping of services and service providers? And then how do you engage youth, even in that assessment phase? And what are the MHPSS considerations around youth engagement? Within the assessment aspect of the toolkit, I've got a screenshot here, and you'll see that we have a decision tree. The toolkit is designed or developed for low and middle income countries and conflict affected. So we've mapped out, tools based upon development, ongoing conflict, and acute emergency, just to provide a quick reference if you just quickly want to see what are some of the assessment tools that might be recommended for that kind of implementing environment. You'll also notice that there's, underneath the decision tree, you'll see we've got the tools, and the tools all have within the toolkit, the PDF version, there's always a paragraph that provides a brief summary and discussion around that particular tool and why it was selected for this toolkit. Next slide. Once you have completed the assessment, then you're going to move on to designing your program. The design portion of the toolkit provides, or it discusses, considerations when selecting evidence-based interventions, and even provides some recommendations on how to be able to justify, or the criteria for providing a justification for the intervention that you selected. It also looks at what works in MHPSS programming and recommendations based upon what works. So this includes, some recommendations that around integrating MHPSS interventions into school systems, applying a social ecological approach, focusing on group and or community-based services, integrating 2 or more dimensions of well-being. So maybe looking at, both an intervention that looks at the individual's need, the youth's need, but then also providing support maybe to their caregiver, or having an intervention that looks at that family system, including monitoring and coaching with integrated case management. So to do case management and do it well, what do you need to build into the design of that program? And then clinical supervision for staff, what that is and why is it necessary, and then the hiring of local staff to design and deliver MHPSS services. We also discuss, promising approaches and programs. So the promising approaches and programs, that links back up to the criteria that I mentioned before on how you go about justifying a particular intervention that you've chosen. Some programs, there may be no direct evidence, but existing evidence indirectly supports the intervention's theory of change. So it's promising. We have some examples of promising approaches and programs that we also include in the toolkit. And then budgeting for MHPSS. So what do you need to think about when you're designing your program, when you're working on the budget? And this includes everything from staffing needs, staff costs. So, are you planning on doing a case management aspect or individualized services? What are some considerations for staff on that? What are your considerations around assessment costs, translation services, or adapting interventions? Once you've designed your program, then the toolkit, the next section that follows on is the implementation. So next slide, please. Within implementing MHPSS programming, we look at staffing programs for impact and success, good practice when working with populations with high levels of distress, and then tools for adopting a trauma-informed approach. Throughout the toolkit, you'll see I have this do no harm icon, and we've included that throughout the toolkit. So while we do talk about good practices right here with it implementing on working with populations of high levels of distress, we integrate key considerations throughout the toolkit that are do no harm considerations. So we really see that being something that is an integrated aspect of your program design and approach and planning. It goes from the very beginning of your assessment through the end and closure of the program. We also, within the good practice, we point to psychological first aid and some tools that can be helpful for equipping staff to be able to respond effectively with project beneficiaries who are in need of additional support, and how to refer them on to additional services. The staffing includes a discussion around supervision, MHPSS supervision, and what that is. Sometimes there can be a little bit of confusion as to when we say supervision for MHPSS, we're not talking about simply making sure someone is, doing the job that they're supposed to be doing, but it's really an ongoing continued learning of skills for effective service delivery for mental health and psychosocial support. It's a relationship that supports the service provider's technical competence and practice, and promotes well-being and enables effective and supportive monitoring of the work that they're doing. Next slide, please. The monitoring, evaluation, adapting, and learning aspects of the toolkit includes a couple of components that are I think going to be very practical and useful for users. It does provide guiding questions for when you're developing a meal plan. So what are some of those considerations that you want to have? We link to some tools and resources around meal that specifically have been developed for MHPSS and meal. We also provide a selection of measurement indicators. Next slide, please. The measurement indicators that were developed for this toolkit, we've defined 6 measurement areas. The first one is safety. We have program implementation and access, uptake and compliance, function, mental health and well-being, and care. These 6 measurement areas are then used on the indicator table, and indicators are grouped around those measurement areas. And then we identify which sectors the indicator most directly relates to. So the collection of indicators, the illustrative indicators, was pulled together from reviewing existing indicators at USAID, existing indicators from UNICEF's operational guidelines on community-based MHPSS, and the Interagency Standing Committee's monitoring and evaluation framework for MHPSS. And there are a few indicators that were specifically developed for this toolkit. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the sector pullouts. Next slide. The sector pullouts cover 5 sectors. So we look at education, youth employment, health, violence prevention, peace and security, and then gender and gender-based violence. Next slide. The content of the sector pullouts follow the same format. We're gonna, in just a minute, we're gonna show a couple of examples of some of the content that's in the sector pullouts. but they all provide an introduction that talks about the integration of MHPSS and that particular sector. It links to the IASC intervention pyramid, which, if you recall, was one of the frameworks that we talked about in section 3, and I mentioned I'd get back to later. We look at illustrative indicators and illustrative activities, and then we provide program examples that contribute towards the evidence base. The information, when there is information for a particular case example or program example that we use, we provide information on how to access those program materials. Next slide, please. The illustrative activities within the sector Pullout, they all follow a very similar format, and it's a table that shows the linkages of the dimensions of well-being with the positive youth development domains and then illustrative activities. So this links activities to the positive youth development framework and dimensions of well-being. It also includes activities from the different examples, programming approaches that we looked at, both within that sector Pullout, but also throughout the toolkit when we were doing the evidence review, reviewing the literature. Next slide. The program examples all include an intervention pyramid where we show the layering across the IAC intervention pyramid. We highlight core program elements, and we highlight the relevant research. So in the example of the pyramid that I'm showing here, you'll see that this is the intervention pyramid, and the bottom layer looks at social considerations and basic services and security. And this particular project had awareness raising in the community. It's an activity they did at that level. Community and family support. So they looked at, safe spaces in the community, providing service providers with support, targeted training and ongoing support for service providers. So ensuring that ongoing supervision for service providers. They included referrals to case management services, and then referrals for girls who needed additional services, and referrals for health services. The intervention pyramid, we included as one of the frameworks because it provides, it's a resource or a tool that can help in thinking about how you layer your mental health and psychosocial support interventions. Are you including activities that are responding to the psychosocial support needs? Are you including activities that respond to mental health, the provision of mental health services, and linking those together? The next slide, please. Illustrative indicators. So each sector Pullout includes a sector-specific indicator table. It's a summary on the sector Pullouts for these measurement areas. For the sector Pullouts. It's a summary of the illustrative indicators. You can find a comprehensive list in Annex 3. It also references the source for the indicator and the measurement area. Next slide, please. So thank you. That was a really brief overview of the toolkit components. I'm going to hand it back over to Danya to introduce our partner.
Thank you, Jen. That was a really great overview of the toolkit, and I think it helped give just a sense of what it contains. And I hope that after this webinar, everyone can really take some time to look through the different components. So now that we have a sense of what's included in the toolkit, we are going to spend a little bit of time discussing the application and use. And I would like to hand it over to Tim from Waves for Change to do this. Over to you, Tim.
Cool, thank you very much, Danya. And hello to everyone on the webinar. So my name, like Danya said, my name is Tim Conybeare. I'm the founder of an organization called Waves for Change. I should probably give you a bit of warning. It's the end of the day here in South Africa, and my wife and my 6-year-old baby are due back home any minute, and we're all working from home here. So if you hear any disruption in the background, that's a very grumpy baby coming home from a long day at the office. But what I thought I would do just for the next 10 minutes is try and make a little bit of what's been spoken about a bit more tangible for those of you who are providing programs on the ground, and walk you through the journey of founding Waves for Change, which is a youth development organization based in South Africa. And we provide what we call surf therapy programs to vulnerable young people. So it's combining the sport of surfing with psychoeducation. We provide this directly to just under 2,000 young people a month in South Africa, and we do it in referral with hospitals, clinics, and schools. We then have a global network of partners. We work with 34 international partners, and we help them introduce mental health and psychosocial programming to their programs as well. So we have this kind of partner training module to our work. And I thought what I could do is give you the brief story about how we turned a surf club in South Africa, which was a voluntary surf club with 20 children on a weekend, into this kind of mental health organization with an international focus. So briefly to start with, like I say, Waves for Change started as a surfing club. It was a voluntary surfing club that we ran on a beach in Cape Town. I used to run it on my weekends around work, and we used to just pick young people up from South African townships. These are kind of low-income areas just outside of the city, and come to the beach. It was very informal. It was all designed for fun. We had 1 or 2 unemployed people from the community who used to come with us. And relatively quickly, after about 6 months or so of programming, again, it was voluntary, we started to understand that the young people who were coming to this club faced tremendous amount of adversity at home. And what we needed to do, or what we were being asked to do as a club, was respond to their psychological needs and their social needs, because these are both areas of their lives that were significantly underserved by the local government. So we had a look at what psychological services and social services were available in Masiphumelele Township, the community that the young people came from. We realized the ratio at the time of social workers to young people was 1 social worker to 30,000 young people. There was 1 high school with no counseling service or anything. So it was a fairly dire situation. And we thought, well, as a surfing club, as a sports program that's designed to deliver a sports program, how can we meet the mental health and the psychosocial needs of these young people? So, I mean, we went through a process, just as is mapped out in this toolkit. The toolkit obviously wasn't available 12 years ago when we founded. So it took us probably about 5 years to do what the toolkit could probably help you do in 6 months. But some of the key steps that we did is we looked at kind of the concept of social support. And we found that the club provided that. What was it about the club that provided that? It was a chance to interact with your peers. And the club was led by community members. My role increasingly became to train these community members to teach young people to surf in a safe way that was inclusive of all people. But we found that the club allowed people to make these social connections that made them feel stronger, more confident. So an element of social support was offered, but the psychological component, how could we help young people understand the emotions they were going through and experiencing as a result of the experiences they were having? So we looked at different ways that different sectors approach psychoeducation, and we developed a curriculum. We teamed up with a few mental health care professionals, and we looked at mostly practice within positive psychology. We didn't want to pathologize anything. We wanted everything to be very positive. And it's all built towards building confidence and coping skills. So yeah, like I said, we developed the psychoeducation curriculum, and we realized that when young people could come to the beach, they could form these social connections. Social support would get better. They could learn coping skills, so that the capacity to cope with stress and understand stress would improve. But what we also realized was that when they left the beach, they went to an environment that was less enabling. So how could we provide social support away from the beach? And we realized we needed to go and talk with parents, talk with teachers, just help them understand a little bit what was happening at the beach. So this all took place over a period of about 4 or 5 years, and it helped us transform what was at the time a club, a very unstructured surfing club, into a more supportive environment. But you can see, there's quite a few inputs and there's quite a lot of stuff you need to do. So how do you grow that and how do you scale it? It's quite a difficult thing to do. Lots of competing inputs, quite complex. And we realized that the most important component of all of this work was the coach, was the person that was delivering this. If you have someone, and we looked at kind of other interventions, cognitive behavior therapy, for example. and you look at literature reviews and what works there, if a lot of the success of these interventions hinges on the relationship between the caregiver or the person delivering the service and the person attending. And we realized much was, yep.
So sorry to interrupt you. Would you mind switching your camera on? We just noticed that it was off and we were trying to spotlight your video. Thank you so much.
No problems. Cool. Thank you. I wasn't sure if I should turn it on or leave it off. So yeah, like I was saying, that the coaches, we realized that there's such, in our term, we call them the coaches. These are the people who deliver the program. They are the vital ingredient. And if we could build their capacity to form meaningful relationships with young people, to deliver really fun and engaging activities that boosted confidence, to understand the psychoeducation curriculum and deliver it, and do these kind of home visits, school visits, build a community around these young people, we realized we might be able to grow this. So understanding that, you know, the coach is a really, really important component of this work. How could we optimize that? You know, we realized if we deployed more coaches, we could reach more people. We then quickly realized that if the coach is going to deliver an impactful service, they need to be supervised. Supervision means a number of things. Obviously, you know, they're delivering a slightly more complex intervention. We looked at kind of other types of sports intervention where you're delivering health educational curriculum, which can be learned, and you know, it's more looking to improve someone's knowledge about a certain topic. This is slightly more nuanced. It's teaching young people behaviors that can help them understand and master emotion, deploy that, so that's my baby, deploy that behavior in the community away from, our case, the beach. It's a slightly more complex task. So we realized that the coaches we recruited had to be a little bit more skilled, which meant the intervention was going to be a bit more expensive than we initially thought. Those coaches need to be debriefed by psychologists on a fairly regular basis. They take on a lot of the stress and a lot of the experience of the young people they work with. So we started linking up with the mental health communities around our various sites in South Africa. And we also realized that the coaches themselves need to be motivated. So yes, on the one side, we needed to pay them and we needed to give them stipends so that they felt passionate about the work, but they also needed to be supported. As I say, as much as the the people who are supervising the service are making sure they're delivering it with fidelity, they're also making sure that our coaches are psychologically, you know, okay. Because it's not always easy for a coach to be delivering a service like this. So you've got supervision on the one side that looks at fidelity, but we also had a more compassionate type of supervision, which is really just counseling. So we realized that if we were going to grow this, we had to significantly grow the amount of money we were investing in our coaching staff. Slowly, as we grew, we started seeing more common kind of outcomes, and it's really nice to see in the toolkit some of the common outcomes we see through this type of work. For us, obviously, we're operating trying to take we're trying to take a slightly more clinical intervention and take it out of a formal setting and putting it more into an informal setting, like on the beach. And adding, and I see there's some friends of us from grassroots soccer here, and this will probably ring true to them, but adding a sport to the mix really facilitates the shift to this mental health outcome. You've got the natural confidence that comes from playing in a team sport and the natural social connections that come from participating in a team sport. So for us, sport became a really vital component to the intervention. It helped, it really strengthened some of the mechanics of the thing. And what we also saw was self-regulation was a big outcome. So as we introduced the psychoeducation curriculum part, self-regulation was vital. That has various different benefits across educational performance, civic engagement. You start looking at what are the bigger outcomes that are, or impacts, sorry, that are attributed to gains in mental health. So that self-regulation component, we realized we could tie to lots of positive impacts. And I suppose just keeping an eye on time, and with the do no harm component, I think operating in South Africa, where the government is very under-resourced, and I spoke a little bit earlier around pathologizing and diagnosing and referring, we really didn't want to diagnose any young people coming into our service, because then we have a duty to refer them to state services. The trouble there is that the state services here are very under-resourced, so you end up doing more harm referring them to the state than not. That's not to say the state does harm, it's just that they're under-resourced to cope with the needs. So a young person ends up in a system that is fairly well designed to meet their emotional and psychological needs. They just don't get seen. So the waiting list can be a year, 2 years, and they are then exposed to a number of quite uncomfortable conversations. So I suppose one of the considerations at baseline when young people get referred into your service and the different partners you're working with is what legal responsibility do you take on by screening young people, and what do you really want to know at baseline. And then I suppose the final thing is, kind of monitoring the intervention as well. I understand that the mental health is built up, but it needs to be sustained. It's not, it doesn't just improve over a couple of sessions and then you can take the intervention away. We found that we needed to create opportunities for young people to remain engaged with us over the long term. So again, that changed our design. And it also changed a little bit how we monitor the program. We see our intervention very much like a counselling service. We want people to attend as much as possible. So tracking things just like the number of young people coming didn't really work for us anymore. We needed to track the names of the individuals coming. We needed to see how often they were coming. If they didn't attend for a couple of weeks, we needed to go and follow up, do home visits, get them back into the service. Because I think there was a really nice example that Jennifer gave at the beginning of the talk that, you know, the brain is reshaping in adolescence, but it only reshapes if you've got this continuous exposure to these safe spaces, these caring adults. So dosage becomes a key concern. So what is your capacity to know the name of every child that's in your service, follow them up if they're dropping out, and then, you know, how do you understand the growth of those young people through your program? What we found at Waves for Change is it takes about 8 sessions for them to settle. So we've been working with the New School in New York, looking at the changes in physiology as young people come through these programs, and we realized that it takes about 8 sessions for their bodies to settle and for them to be able to onboard and take new information on. So are you front loading lots of information at the beginning of your program, asking and expecting your participants to learn new information? Or are you building in this kind of long-term membership, this this lead time for them to settle before you start introducing an educational component? So these are all kind of talked about in the toolkit, and we're very proud and honoured to be referenced as an example of a program that's taken some of these considerations on board and adopted them. So very happy as well to answer any questions offline. If anyone wants to get in touch, please do. But I hope that was useful. I think, yeah, we've learned that mental health interventions are quite complex. You've got lots of competing inputs. They can be quite difficult to scale, but they're very, very impactful. And they're not as complicated as we thought. You know, a safe space of caring adults, something fun to do. It does a world of good for people if those adults are the right people and the dose is sustained. So I hope that was useful. Thank you very much for having me on. I think that's my 10 minutes up. Yeah, and I'll hand back.
Thank you so much, Tim, for taking the time and also for sharing what MHPSS programs look like in practice and the different challenges and different opportunities that you faced. We're now going to move on to the Q&A portion of the webinar where we'll get to answer some of your questions. And I'd like to call on Jennifer Groves to come back on. Jennifer, we have a question. Hi. We have a question from SITA, and she was wondering about what are some important elements for integration into broader programming from your perspective. So I imagine that's integration of MHPSS into broader programmings as we highlighted the different sectors earlier.
Great, thank you. It's an important question, and it's something the toolkit was designed to address and be useful in. So I'm just going to I'm going to share a screen. Okay. I hoping I could share it. I want to take you to, oh, there we go. Take you to the toolkit itself. And I thought that it might be helpful just to see a practical demonstration of how you can access this information in the toolkit. So there were 2 places that kind of came to mind pretty quickly when I saw that question. The first one is if we go to the PDF version of the toolkit. So I'm just going to scroll down here, complete toolkit. And then in the Annex 2, illustrative interventions. So in our illustrative interventions, you can see, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger because I think that's probably, these illustrative interventions follow the different sectors. So we provide examples of interventions or activities that you can include across these sectors that we looked at in the toolkit. So for example, under education, we have providing teachers and educators with psychosocial support, or engaging community in the maintaining of school facilities and developing strategies for increased school safety. That particular intervention example comes from some of the work that Glasswing does in Latin America. If we go to the violence prevention, peace and security, this looks at offering structured activities for youth that target physical activity, interpersonal skills, and curriculum focused on developing coping skills. So those are just a few quick examples from the toolkit of how you can quickly go and look at some examples of activities you can do to integrate MHPSS. Additionally, for more discussion or information on those sectors and the integration, we have the sector pullouts. So in the sector pullouts, here's where you'll find the, I think they're like 4 pages or 5 pages in length for education, gender and gender-based violence, health, violence prevention, peace and security, and youth employment. And each of these, provide that discussion around MHPSS integration into that sector. So thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. We have another question. This might be more specifically to gender. So I'm interested in hearing more about the way you have addressed gender, disability, and inclusion in the toolkit. And I believe you said something about this being in section 2.
So we acknowledged in section 2 that disability inclusion is a key gap within the evidence. So what we looked at was that there were very few research programs that examined how interventions should be adapted to meet the needs of youth with disabilities. We did see that Waves for Change presented today, they provided examples of how they adapt programs and evaluate those programs for youth with additional needs. So that was one example that we found to be particularly interesting, but most programs were not looking at or evaluating how their interventions were responding to the MHPSS needs of those with disability or additional inclusion needs. Gender, on the other hand, there are programs that specifically look at gender and MHPSS around gender. So the sector pull out that we have gender and gender-based violence. We combined them, even though we realize that they are 2 very distinctive areas in of themselves. But these programs, we looked at one that was focused specifically on adolescent girls and their mental health and psychosocial needs. And then we looked at another one that looked at, which I think, the Real Fathers Initiative. And that looked at the relationships or how fathers were receiving mentoring and support from other men within the community who were recognized as being good examples of a positive parenting and leadership within their families, and the importance of the relationship between the fathers and their partners. So it recognized the role that the women played in that relationship, but really focused on helping them with the skills, helping fathers with the skills to have positive parenting approaches and reduce violence in the home. So we look at that through some of the program examples, and then it does come up throughout the toolkit and mentioned in various places.
Thank you, Jen. We're going to take one more question, and this one is addressed to Tim. So Tim, if you wouldn't mind just coming back on for a second. Tim, what advice do you have for an implementer, maybe a community-based organization that's thinking of expanding to provide MHPSS to youth populations to make sure they do not do? And just recognizing the time, if we could keep the answer really short. I see that your baby has joined us here today.
We have a special guest. Here's Max. Nikki, I was actually just typing a response. I think I mean, our advice to partners who are just starting out is usually to try not to go too big too quick. Just understanding that your staff do need some supervision and do need some support. It's trying to go community-based organizations we found have actually been quite impactful as well, because the staff tend to be from the community. They understand the lived experience of the community, the people they're working with. Our advice is always to try and just make sure you have the adequate human resource to provide the support to your frontline workers. If you have a low ratio of kind of support for your frontline workers, you get frontline worker burnout quite quickly, and then you end up doing quite a lot of harm. So I'd say just try and, we usually say grow slow and grow strong. I know it's not what everyone always likes to hear, but we've definitely found especially with mental health programming, the capacity to cause quite a lot of harm if you go too quick is more than in other sectors. So I'd say really get to understand the needs and the capacity of your local workforce and make sure they're supported first.
Thank you, Tim. And on that note, I'll hand it over to Paul for some closing remarks and next steps.
Great, thanks, Dalia. I know that we're almost out of time, so I'll be quick. So we're ending this launch with, I'm going to end this launch with a brief discussion of the next steps. In developing the toolkit, we reached out to the mission and our other USAID staff colleagues for comments and suggestions about what to include. And based on these comments and our own experience, we created this toolkit to be as useful as we could make it for all of you. We now ask that you download and review the toolkit and give us comments on how it could be improved. We will be sending out a survey in a few days to get your initial feedback, but we also ask that you begin to use the toolkit and send additional feedback at any time in the form of questions or suggestions. You can email the feedback to me and to Abir Al-Dalimi, our senior mental health advisor. We consider this to be a living document that really, with your help, will be revised and made increasingly useful with time. And finally, I'd like to end by pointing out that this toolkit is a reflection of the agency's increasing commitment to good mental health for the world's youth. President Biden talked of the existential threat of climate change. This is just one of many challenges that youth will have to deal with as they come of age, challenges that are not of their making. As their caretakers, we need to do everything that we can to help our youth to bring to these challenges their best efforts and best abilities. Good mental health is one of the key resources they'll need to deal with the future's challenges. We invite you to stay involved and stay in touch and work with us as together we continue to advance global youth mental health. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. My colleague Cole has pasted the links in the chat, so make sure that you save those, and the recording and the slides will be shared after the webinar. Have a great rest of your day.